Thank you. And welcome. I'm Brian Ogilvie, Chair of the History Department here at UMass Amherst. And this afternoon, it is my privilege to welcome you to the 2016 Distinguished Lecture in the UMass 5-College Graduate Program in History, which will be delivered by Professor Talitha LeFlouria of the University of Virginia. It's not my job to introduce her, it's my job to say something about the lecture and then introduce her. Let me just be as brief as possible. Every year, our Distinguished Lecture celebrates the establishment in 1996 of the UMass 5-College Graduate Program, which combines the faculty and resources of the Commonwealth's flagship research university with those of 4 of the nation's leading liberal arts colleges, Amherst, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, and Smith colleges. This collaboration provides our graduate students with a depth of intellectual resources second to none, while allowing faculty at the colleges to contribute to the formation of historians in development. Beginning in 1997 with a lecture by Bonnie Smith of Rutgers University, our annual lecture brings the community together to hear a distinguished historian speak about their scholarship. Past lecturers have included Roger Launius, Glenda Gilmore, Eric Foner, Natalie Zeman-Davis, and Edward Baptist. And we are very pleased to welcome Professor LeFlouria to their distinguished company. This year, we are also fortunate that the Distinguished Lecture dovetails with our biennial Feinberg Family Lecture Series, an endowed series that focuses on a topic at the intersection of history and public policy. The inaugural series commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and this year's theme is the U.S. in the age of mass incarceration, a significant and timely subject. The Feinberg semester activities are possible thanks to the generosity of Mr. Kenneth R. Feinberg, a 1967 alumnus of the UMass History Department, together with his family and friends. Mr. Feinberg completed his BA in history and went on to a distinguished career in law and public service, most notably serving as special master of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. Let me invite you now to the next event in the series. On Wednesday, October 26th, we'll host a panel discussion on resisting police violence in Springfield and beyond. Mothers, scholars, and queer people of color speak out, featuring Kisa Owens, the mother of Delano Walker, Andrea Ritchie, an attorney, writer, and Soros Justice Fellow, Shea Quest of Out Now, Maria Ververis, the mother of Michael Ververis, and Rhonda Y. Williams, a scholar and community activist. This event will be held at 7 p.m. at Shibeli Hall Auditorium at Springfield Technical Community College down in Springfield. Let me also invite you to participate in the series' social media. There's a Facebook page, and our Twitter hashtag is hashtag Feinberg Series. There is a children's table at the back of the room for those of you who may have a restless child with you, so that's available as an option. If there are a few sounds from back there, we ask for your indulgence. There will be a book signing after the talk at the back of the room, so please don't rush the lectern. Nat Harold of Amherst Books is back there with copies of the book, and Professor LeFlouria will be available to sign it afterwards. And now, to underscore that we truly are a UMass 5-college program, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Chris Tinson of Hampshire College, where he teaches Africana Studies and History. Professor Tinson, who is a PhD graduate of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies here at UMass Amherst, will introduce tonight's speaker, so please join me in welcoming him.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, honored to be alive in this moment where we can all struggle collectively. So I want to make some brief remarks to give context to mass incarceration and to welcome our distinguished guests. The critical social theorist and Afrofuturist Janelle Monáe once said, "This is a Cold War. You better know what you're fighting for." Consider the following. Longtime political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal is committed to a slow death row in one of America's fine penal institutions. There's still a $2 million bounty on Assata Shakur. Jalil Muntaqim is still in the Attica dungeon. And so Albert Woodfox was just released after 43 years in solitary confinement in Angola, one of America's most notorious plantation prisons. These are but snapshots of the over 2.3 million people in U.S. prisons, 5 million extra under state supervision, and an additional 12 million coming in and out of American jails on an annual basis. A cold-blooded war, if there ever was one. This adds context to why hunger strikes, labor strikes, and other coordinated actions have hit at least 29 prisons in at least 12 states in the past month, but we haven't taken these actions seriously. We'd rather watch the massive distraction known as the DT circus. Donald Trump. As police across the country continue shooting, killing, harassing, and bullying their way into black and brown lives with impunity, and the eager bullets of racists continue to chase down black and brown bodies, young, old, Muslim, church-going, what have you, we are making history. At no other point in U.S. history have we had as much information about prisons as we do currently. The question becomes, what do we do now that we are beginning to know? This society's carceral continuum is coming into greater focus. And yet it is painful for some to realize that imprisonment and other anti-black violence is inseparable from capitalism. The same people and institutions that benefit from capitalism are the same people and institutions that benefit from imprisonment. Capitalism means distinctions must be made, and those distinctions are always political. Considering this, it may be more apt for us to update the widespread usage of the prison industrial complex as a term describing our current state, and might we update it to call it capitalist penal democracy? Call it what you will, the show must go on. Standing firmly in the tradition of black resilience, healing, and resistance, the movement for black lives, and the new scholarly work coming out on the vast and largely hidden history of carceral democracy gives the mobilizing work new urgency. Its policy document calls for nothing short of an end to the forces that destabilize black life. So, my friends, the Feinberg series is not only a series of lessons in history, it is an activist-rooted intellectual challenge to the logic of the carceral state. The social theorist and prison abolitionist Joy James contextualized our current state as one locked in between grief and action. As she states, the implications of public servants and deputized vigilantes violating black life with impunity are profound, especially for young black people. Police agencies have a history of racial bias and racial violence that has been investigated and condemned by governments as well as civil and human rights organizations. Citizens, she continues, are supposed to flee or fight criminals, not the police. But reality and history teaches you that in black life, you need be ever vigilant for both. Later, she adds, what is black death in American society and under American democracy but a political phenomenon? We are troubled by current black sufferings fueled by the new Jim Crow or neo-slavery in a punitive mandate. Yet our language is rarely considered political when we speak of these challenges and the fragmentation that dismembers the beloved community that King promised we would see from the mountaintop. The current uptick in historical attention on imprisonment, from Dr. LeFlouria's timely and important book, Chained in Silence, to Ava DuVernay's recent Netflix release, The 13th, to Naomi Murakawa's new book, The First Civil Rights, How Liberals Built Prison America, is promising and long overdue. And it should not go unnoticed that women scholars and artists are leading the charge in this effort. So long as this work is tied to efforts to restore communities hard hit by the carceral state, it will not be in vain. The work of restoration is accompanied by the work of excavation, especially the histories of ritualized and racialized gendered violence and resistance experienced by US-based Black women in the New South. Digging up lost or unknown histories of racial violence, their attendant state-sanctioned silences, and the absence of reparative justice must be our collective work. It is this work that our distinguished guest has begun with force. Dr. Talitha LeFlouria is an associate professor of African American Studies in the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. She's the author of Chained and Silenced Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South, which was featured in the Sundance Award documentary Slavery by Another Name, based on Douglas Blackman's Pulitzer Prize-winning book on convict labor in the Southern states. Currently, she serves on the board of directors for the Labor and Working Class History Association and Historians Against Slavery. Please join me in giving a warm Five College welcome to Dr. Talitha LeFlouria.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm truly honored to be here and would like to extend major thanks to the coordinators of this wonderful event for inviting me to join you to share some of my insights on the history of Black women's imprisonment and experiences of state-sanctioned violence in the United States. It's no secret to anyone in this room that America is in a state of emergency. The Black body count is rising, the carceral crisis is still unresolved, hatred is ravaging our hopes, and the future seems bleak. And while images of Black men litter our Facebook feeds and haunt us in our freedom dreams, Black women and girls remain nearly invisible. Ironically, however, Black women and girls today are just as hyper-visible to police as they were during the post-emancipation period, and they are equally vulnerable to state-sanctioned anti-Black violence and the predations of the carceral state. And the culture of silence that exists around these issues is no less pervasive and perpetual now than it was in the past. Sadly, the overemphasis on the plight of the Black male in the U.S. injustice system and their experiences of state-sanctioned anti-Black violence has resulted in the obscuring of Black women and girls' experiences of mass imprisonment and violence. The Black female has been left suffering on the margins. Although Black women's experiences of police violence and their relationship to the carceral state has been very similar to Black men, their cries have been and are still being drowned out amid the deafening defense of Black manhood. The devaluing and, quote, deadening of Black womanhood, to borrow from historian Collie Gross's turn of phrase, is no doubt the result of white supremacy, sexism, and patriarchal dominance. But I wonder how much of this victimization is being spurred on or even emboldened by the outright ambivalence that is frequently shown to broken Black female bodies. I ask myself often, why is it that Black women and girls' lives don't matter? Although frequently overlooked, ignored, or disengaged in broader public and historical conversations on the subject, the Black female has been adversely affected by mass incarceration and state-sanctioned violence since the moment, again, emancipation was legally recognized in the South, the place where I argue the roots of Black female and male mass incarceration were initially planted. When we use the past as a window into the present, it becomes clear that today's crisis is merely a continuation. Not a new development per se, but part of a long-standing practice that has been with us, again, since the end of the Civil War. My recently published book, Chained in Silence, Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South, was written as a corrective to the male-centric, uneven rendering of the history of convict leasing and the chain gang system. It was my way of moving working-class incarcerated Black women and girls' lives, labors, travails, and fleeting triumphs from the margin to the center of historical and historiographical discourse for the historians in the room, accounting for the prominent role they played in rebuilding the physical and economic infrastructure of the South, again after the Civil War. Off the grid, tucked away in flying railroad camps, brickyards, chain gangs, lumber mills, mines, plantations, stockades, kitchens, wash houses, barns, and big houses, thousands of African American women prisoners lived, labored, suffered, and died. Yet their lives are nearly impossible to trace in writing from the post-Civil War era, and they still remain largely outside the historical literature's field of reference due to their limited numbers and/or overarching perceptions about their reduced profitability when compared with black men, or from limitations wrought by the scarcity of historical evidence. Nowhere is this absence most deeply felt than in the masculinist realm of convict labor studies, where a woman's worth is least regarded. It is within this historiographical space of convict labor studies that women prisoners' contribution to the forging of New South modernity has tended to be measured in terms of productivity and profit alone. While my study has shown that black female convicts did, in fact, supply a rich source of labor and profit to Southern industrialists, there are other considerations to be made in our assessment of a woman's worth to the postbellum carceral state. From an institutional perspective, for instance, the black female presence helped foster significant changes to the penal system of New South Georgia and was the catalyst for early prison reform movements. Economically speaking, African American women prisoners executed new forms of labor that remained untried in the free labor marketplace, therefore broadening the overall scope of black women's work in the post-emancipation South. These facts, among others, make it difficult to deny that gender is significant to the study of convict labor in the post-Civil War South. It has become quite clear to me that without the female perspective, it is difficult to grasp the complexities of this history. The reality is that incarcerated women experienced captivity in uniquely gendered ways. For them, life in a convict lease camp or on a chain gang was in many ways worse than slavery, for reasons that extend beyond their decline in material worth after the collapse of slavery or the excessive violence that followed. Unlike their male counterparts, imprisoned women were much more privy to sexual assault, pregnancy, and what I like to call menacing reproduction. The decline in African American women's procreative worth also made their laboring bodies susceptible to new forms of reproductive exploitation. All things considered, it's my firm belief that it is the inclusion of women in the historical discourse that best complicates the static notion that convict leasing was nothing more than slavery by another name. While it is true that convict labor systems replicated the cycles of violence, brutality, exploitation, and bodily commodification found in plantation slavery, it is through the female lens that we are best able to see the ways in which black female maternity was reviled in a way that it hadn't been before emancipation. Whereas in the old South slavocracy, reproduction was the linchpin for slaveholders' financial success, the New South fiscal model saw pregnancy and childbirth as threats to economic progress and productivity. Hence, children born to incarcerated mothers had no fiduciary value, and these disposable bodies were prone to death and disappearance. So it is these types of subtle variances between slavery and convict labor that reveal the rich gendered nuances that underlie the female experience of captivity. But African American women's unique experiences of involuntary servitude in the postbellum South does not stop there, but is also reflected in their laboring practices, gendered experiences of violence, and resistance techniques. In mapping the origins of black female mass incarceration, again, one must begin in the post-Civil War South, where the highest concentration of black female incarcerees once resided. In the aftermath of emancipation, white Southerners made undermining black freedom and reasserting white supremacy a major priority. The suppression of black freedom was first codified in state-sponsored black codes and vagrancy laws that severely restricted freed people's social, economic, and political mobility in the case of black men and regulated black life. White Southerners also utilized physical assault, rape, and lynching as a means to control freedom and movement, to dissuade freed people and their offspring from becoming independent economic actors, to stymie educational and political progress, to perpetuate fear, and most importantly, to reassert white supremacy. In my attempts to graphically underscore the disposability of African American life and the unrestricted nature of violence visited upon Black female victims during this period, I'd like to defer to the case of a young woman named Sarah Neely. As reported by anti-lynching activist and Memphis native Ida B. Wells, Neely, quote, a colored girl, was arrested for, quote, some trumped-up charge and forced to labor on an Alabama prison farm. The day after her arrival at the farm, she was bucked and, quote, stretched across a log, her clothing drawn up, and while her hands and feet were being held by Negroes, presumably by force, the white guard, who was the son of the planter, gave her 100 lashes with a buggy trace. But the beating did not stop there. Neely was then handcuffed, her feet tied together, and a rope put around her neck and drawn up until her toes barely touched the ground. She was kept in this condition from 10 a.m. until 12 o'clock noon, when she was released and crawled away. She was, quote, afterward ordered to go to work. But being unable, the guard beat her on the head and jumped upon her stomach. Before 3 o'clock, she was dead, end quote. And there's no evidence in the historical record that points to anyone being charged for her murder. So in many ways, Sarah Neely is today's Sandra Bland, in my opinion. Like violence, the penal system was a highly potent weapon used to suppress Black autonomy and spur the redevelopment of the South's post-war economy and infrastructure. Ironically, it was a clause in the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the amendment that legally abolished slavery, that actually allowed for the disproportionate arrest and incarceration of African American men, women, and youth. The amendment declared that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. With the system of chattel slavery no longer in place, white Southern businessmen came to rely on the state as a new supplier of, quote, prison slaves. Southern state governments and motivated industrialists exploited the constitutional loophole and capitalized on the growing pool of long-term felony offenders who could be used to work in newly formed industries and prison camps, while at the same time reviving the region's war-torn economy. Through convict leasing, a system that permitted private contractors to lease felony inmates from the state and assume total control over their welfare and working bodies, Southern entrepreneurs were able to build their fortunes on the backs of Black prisoners, women included. In the state of Georgia in particular, which is the site of my research, the first spike in Black female mass incarceration occurred between 1868 and 1880. The second spike occurred between 1881 and 1908, the year convict leasing was abolished in the state and the chain gang system decentralized. During these years, African American women made up 3% of the total felony population and roughly 5% of the short-term misdemeanor chain gang population, but they made up more than 98% of the female prison and jail populations overall. In terms of their alleged crimes, roughly 90% of long-term female felons were convicted of burglary and violent crimes such as murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, assault, and arson. Oftentimes, their crimes were occasioned by a need or desire to self-defend against abusive fathers, lovers, and spouses. For those women and teenage girls who were convicted of non-fatal violent crimes, their prison terms were rarely set below 5 years. But over 75% of convicted murderesses, as they were called, were actually sentenced to life imprisonment. If a woman found herself imprisoned in a convict lease camp, she could expect to be worked 12 to 14 hours a day doing any combination of the following: grading surfaces for railroads, laying tracks, mining clay, firing bricks, building roads, digging ditches, smelting iron, chopping down trees, harvesting turpentine, plowing fields, hoeing weeds, and picking crops. Female inmates had... Excuse me? Oh, sorry. Female inmates had the added burden of cooking meals, cleaning camp kitchens, laundering acres of soiled linens and garments, or even working as the private servants of lessees, wardens, or other penal authorities. Misdemeanor chain gang women, on the other hand, primarily built roads. In Georgia especially, gender conventions were routinely disregarded due to the vast array of industries that emerged in the state following the Civil War, which precipitated the indiscriminate use of male and female felon labor. Unlike today's system of imprisonment, which primarily generates profit through the warehousing of bodies as opposed to labor exploitation, the penal regimes of the industrially driven New South capital heavily relied on the energies of incarcerated workers, again, women and girls included, for its economic growth and viability. It is only when we look at the less familiar narratives of the imprisoned female labor force that we gain a complete picture of the occupational responsibilities and burdens held by Southern Black women whose work has been widely understood in binary terms. Most scholars have contended that during the post-emancipation period, the rigorous limitations placed on Black women's work forced them into two distinct professional categories: agricultural or domestic service. Yet within the convict lease and chain gang systems of Georgia, African American women's working roles were much more variable. Ironically, the mutability of Georgia's carceral structure expanded the possibilities of Black women's labor in the New South while simultaneously immobilizing female detainees. The barriers that had impeded ex-bond women and their daughters from moving beyond the field and domestic service were unsuitable to Georgia's penal enterprises. Hence, I've come to conclude that African American women's presence within the state's industrially driven convict lease and chain gang systems helped modernize the postbellum South by actually creating a new and dynamic set of occupational burdens and competencies for Black women that had not been previously tested in the free labor market or allowed in the free labor market. The precarious work arrangements that evolved in Georgia's post-war prison camps were a partial derivative of the Old South plantation regime. In the antebellum period, planters established a promiscuous pattern of utilizing female slaves in masculine modes of field labor. The most, quote, athletic members of the female sex were sometimes forced to dig ditches, cut trees, and haul lumber. Although the convict leasing paradigm embodied some tenuous aspects of plantation slavery, including the ungendering of bondwomen's labor to satisfy fluctuating financial and work-related needs, lessees decisively prioritized heavy manual work as the status quo, not the exception. And much of this had to do with the decline of Black women's reproductive worth after slavery. So in the New South penal economy, a dramatic shift occurred whereby conviction as opposed to conception became the principal method used to grow bound labor forces. Lessees, unlike slaveholders, had no financial incentive to preserve the fertility of their rented chattel and cared little if women were rendered sterile or suffered gynecological complications as a result of the extreme and heavy labor they were forced to perform. Georgia's railroad system was actually the first industry to experiment with the use of Black female prison labor. In 1869, less than 1 year after assuming sole proprietorship over Georgia's felons, the Atlanta-based contracting firm Grant Alexander and Company had in its possession 17 female inmates, all of whom were former slaves. Born into bondage, Mary Brooks enjoyed 3 years of freedom before she was restored to a lifetime of involuntary servitude. In March 1868, at the tender age of 16, she was convicted of murder by a Bartow County judge and sentenced to natural life in the walls of the state penitentiary, where she and 12 other women worked as cooks, washerwomen, and seamstresses. 1 year later, Brooks and her co-laborers traded in their sewing machines, cooking utensils, and wash tubs for pickaxes, carts, and shovels. By 1874, roughly 32 women had been, quote, farmed out to the Macon and Augusta, Brunswick and Albany, and airline railroads. In these railroad camps, female convicts did the same kind of work as men did in the cuts, as it was called, where they graded surfaces for railroads, drove carts, and shoveled dirt. In the absence of modern technology, the work had to be done by hand in a time-consuming process that required great physical strength and dexterity that many women did not have. Graders milled miles of terrain, while cart drivers helped load large pieces of rock and debris in a wheelbarrow, then rolled it up the dirt rock heap of the cuts. The tough grind of railroad construction lasted from sunup to sundown, leaving female prisoners desperately exhausted and unable to churn out more labor. Weak women workers were sometimes flogged and hit with rocks that would, quote, knock them speechless as a means of stimulating greater productivity in the workplace. In 1892, the entire female prison population in the state of Georgia was uprooted and replanted in Elbert County. At the Camp Herdmont prison plantation, which you see cycling around, there's a sketch and it says queer colony of female convicts. That's actually a sketch of Camp Herdmont. This is a place which was actually the first centralized female prison camp in the state of Georgia. All of the female prisoners in the entire state were leased to one leasee, and his name was William Henry Maddox. And he employed a three-tiered approach to convict leasing, which was industrial, agricultural, and domestic in nature. So on his prison plantation, women prisoners plowed fields, sowed crops, paddled through rivers of cotton, felled trees, sawed lumber, ran grist mills, ginned cotton, forged iron, cooked meals, cleaned camp quarters, and washed soiled garments. Eliza Randall, a convicted murderess, was the chief engineer at the camp, and she was put in charge of running the grist mill and doing half of the blacksmithing for the farm. Over a dozen other women were forced to work as lumberjacks and to assemble a small-scale lumber mill for commercial and domestic purposes. Now, lumberjacking was an extremely dangerous and unsparing occupation, ordinarily restricted to strong, practiced men. Inexpert at the trade, and in many instances, again, lacking the physical power to fell the trees or maneuver their limp torsos, female convicts were often severely wounded. Some were crushed by falling logs, while others were dismembered by misdirected axe blades or aggrieved by the pain of dislocated bones and muscle tears. Rose Henderson understood firsthand the dangers lurking in the pine forest. On March 19, 1896, the lumber woman was, quote, hurt by a falling tree and laid up in the camp hospital for 6 days before being driven back into the forest. In a similar instance, 44-year-old Sarah Johnson was nearly crushed to death by a falling tree. After the incident, she spent close to 1 month convalescing in the camp infirmary. Now, as it pertains to the plight of misdemeanor offenders, most African-American women and girls who were forced to do time on chain gangs, having been charged with petty crimes such as larceny or vagrancy, were rendered terms that usually lasted anywhere from 3 months to 1 year. But the degree of labor one was required to perform within this time frame and the amount of violence an individual likely experienced was disproportionate to one's otherwise short sentence. Chain gang operators compressed years of labor into these compact terms, and if a worker, young or old, sick or able-bodied, failed to meet the labor demands imposed on her, she was, quote, whipped with a rawhide till the blood ran down. To be clear, in multiple localities throughout the carceral South, women worked like men and were beaten like men. There was no regard for their gender position, and the only time their femininity or womanhood was invoked was when they were raped. Unfortunately, antebellum notions about the unrapeability of black women were superimposed onto the postbellum legal landscape, allowing white men to sexually terrorize African American women prisoners unchecked by the law. But even floggings and beatings themselves frequently bordered on the sexual. Female captives were often whipped, quote, stark naked in the presence of male onlookers. So there are many reports and investigations that reveal how male convicts saw other female convicts being whipped naked, and they would report to the investigative committee of Georgia, and this is how this information, was ascertained. The technologies of terror deployed against incarcerated black women and girls varied according to the whims of the abuser. Some were crammed into sweat boxes, which you see a picture of a sweat box circling around, while others were fastened into bucking machines, which you also see pictured up here. And these devices served as high-tech substitutes for the traditional practice of bucking, where a female victim, often partially or completely nude, was forced to lay bound across a log where she was brutally flogged with the whip. These whippings were frequently carried out in the presence of others to set an example, to invoke fear, and to demonstrate the consequences that were sure to befall any individual who dared test the rude power of the law. One of the most illustrative examples that comes to mind, which vividly highlights the ferocity with which female prisoners were handled, is found in the case of 18-year-old Lizzie Boatwright. On March 1st, 1897, Boatwright was convicted in the Superior Court of McDuffie County, Georgia, for the crime of burglary and sentenced to serve 6 months on a local chain gang. On the word of the judge who ruled in her case, Boatwright and another young woman were, quote, found in possession of certain articles of clothing that had been stolen from a house near the Georgia Railroad. When confronted, the teenagers swore that the $4 or $5 worth of garments, quote, had been given to them by a boy, and they held no involvement in the robbery whatsoever. But their pleading was in vain. Out of options, the pair agreed to, quote, take a verdict of guilty with the recommendation that they be punished as for misdemeanors. They were each sentenced to pay a fine of $50. Okay, so during that time period, that was quite a bit of money, and if you were poor, usually you weren't able to accrue the money unless family members gathered together and pooled their meager resources to get you out of, buy you off of the chain. But in the case of Lizzie Boatwright, her family didn't have the money, so she ended up having to serve out the sentence on the chain gang. She ended up serving 6 months on the chain gang. So a few weeks into her sentence, Boatwright was actually spotted by the special inspector of the misdemeanor convict camps, who found her, quote, clad in male attire, wearing the same make of coat, pants, and shoes as were worn by the male convicts. She was working as a man, the only difference being that she used a short-handled spade while the men used long-handled shovels, end quote. Initially mistaking her for a, quote, half-grown boy among the men, the inspector, quote, called her out from the gang and asked her how often she had been whipped, by whom, and how. She stated that the former guard, Bob Cannon, whipped her and another, quote, Negro woman twice for trivial offenses. In one instance, the women were flogged, quote, because our feet were sore and we stopped on the side of the road to fix the rags so as to protect them from the heavy brogan shoes we were wearing. Mr. Cannon made me take down my breeches and lean over, and then he whipped me, said Boatwright. She continued, the other convicts were all around us. One time when he started to whip me, I was sick with my monthlies, and I told him so and begged him to take me away from among the men, but he cursed me and made me drop my breeches, and he whipped me there close to the men convicts, end quote. When I read Boatwright's story, and when I read her story, her testimony, for the first time, I was both stunned and horrified by the details, just as many of you are. It's the same feeling I got in 2015 when I watched Charnisha Corley pouring out her heart to CNN anchor Don Lemon about a similar experience. On June 21st, 2015, Corley was stripped naked by a Texas sheriff's deputy and, quote, administered a cavity search of her genitals because of suspicions she was in possession of marijuana, end quote. After being pulled over allegedly running a stop sign, a male and female officer took her around the side of the car. Then the female officer told her to pull her pants down. Quote, I bent over and she proceeded to stick her fingers in me, and I popped up immediately and I told her, no, what are you doing? You can't do that to me, Corley reported. I felt like they raped me, she said. I wish I could say that the parallels that exist between Corley and Boatwright, Sarah Neely, Sandra Bland, all of whom are separated by time and space yet united in their pain, is merely coincidence. Unfortunately, the reality is that when it comes to Black women's experiences of state-sanctioned anti-Black violence, there is little separation between the past and present at all. In fact, I would argue that the past is the present. The patterns of brutality that we're witnessing today is part of a long continuum that stretches from slavery to the present. Sandra Bland's death while in police custody, for example, along with the deaths of scores of other Black women, some of whom have been named, others whose names still remain unspoken, is situated at the end of a long chain that links enslaved women who were raped, beaten, and killed by vicious overseers, slave patrollers, and planters, to those who were lynched in the Jim Crow South or brutalized, ravished, and slain by whipping bosses, guards, and lessees in southern prison camps, to those who were sexually assaulted, pummeled with billy clubs, and murdered during the civil rights movement, to those who are being savagely beaten, sexually assaulted, and killed on a routine basis today. To be frank, we didn't just get here, we've been here all along, and the culture of silence that exists around these issues is equally unexceptional, it's perpetual. With that said, For as much as black women have been victimized historically and in the present, they have also struggled to resist. For example, just to go back for a moment to the chain gang and to the convict lease camps, within the confines of the South's prison camps, some incarcerated women ran away in hopes of securing freedom from overwork or to escape physical and/or sexual abuse, while others set fires, physically resisted their abusers, and destroyed property. The act of burning clothes, for example, became one way in which some African American women prisoners reclaimed their bodily integrity. So in this instance, they're sort of resisting this compulsory defeminization that they feared in the past, but also in the present, as we see in the case of the attack of the high school girl by the South Carolina resource officer who basically charged her like he was on a football field because he did not recognize her as a black girl. He adultified her and also masculinized her all in the same terms. We see the same thing when we look at Sandra Bland being wrestled to the ground and, extreme force being applied to women. So this sort of compulsory defeminization of black women started really in this post-emancipation context, and it also visits us or is present with us today. So for the sake of context, let me just go back to this point about the burning of clothes. It's important to note that the demeaning assault on black femininity through dress and labor was actually one of the many methodologies, and violence, was one of the many methodologies used to punish female captives, reinforce racial subordination and gendered inferiority, and to offset the strides black women made to have their womanhood acknowledged after the Civil War. Prevailing notions of femininity and the security that, quote, proper women deserved were intertwined with whiteness and generally denied to women of color. White Southerners disparaged freed women's attempts to what they called, quote, play the lady. Weighed down by imprisonment and all of its masculine accessories, Molly White and Nora Daniel were among those who exhibited their frustrations by setting their garments ablaze at the Chattahoochee Brickyard. The whipping boss punished the young women on 2 separate occasions, rendering them 10 lashes apiece in each instance for burning shirts and burning clothes. Understanding their material value to the leasee and the intricate connection between uniforms and the production of labor, these female convicts were symbolically destroying the leasee's property to undermine orderly attempts toward reducing them into objects of profit and property, and to satisfy an internal desire to have their womanhood and humanity recognized. In their attempts to undermine the carceral South, its architects, and the violence that it engendered, female inmates also engaged in more secret and subversive forms of protest. These women practiced the art of everyday resistance, a phrase used by historian Stephanie Camp to describe the covert acts of dissent and discrete ways of regaining control over parts of one's life, which in the carceral context included theft, working slowly or sloppily, or other forms of sabotage. In critiquing black women's experiences and realities with the postbellum carceral state and state-sanctioned anti-black gendered violence, we see that, again, there's merely a delicate thread separating the past and present. Hence, for those who are seeking to understand the present-day crisis in black female mass incarceration and anti-black violence, it is important that one look at it through the prism of the past, because it is in this space that the root is buried. Again, so sadly, the same factors that precipitated these issues then applies now. The nefarious social, economic, material, and legal conditions that beleaguered black women and some girls during the post-emancipation period have been restored to life in the nation's modern penal system. The common threads of racism, unemployment, poverty, educational disparities, domestic abuse, physical and sexual violence, and emotional trauma have helped create and reinforce black female criminality across time and space. Since the 1980s, the number of all women in prisons and jails has grown by more than 8 times, and roughly 2/3 of imprisoned women in the U.S. are women of color. Although new reports have actually pointed to the decline in rates of incarceration for black women, women of color are still disproportionately represented in female prison population totals. The war on drugs has resulted in the uneven incarceration of black female offenders who have become scapegoats of tough-on-crime rhetoric and targets of drug-busting operations. Structural racism anchored in the rise of the prison industrial complex, a term used to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems, and the denial of rehabilitative services or even jobs and other resources that could be created in lieu of funding more prisons, or even jobs and other resources that could be created in lieu of funding more prisons to warehouse more bodies, results in the mass removal of people of color and poor people from society into institutional captivity. Sadly, these disappearing acts are equally prevalent among Black girls and girls of color who are being funneled into the nation's juvenile injustice system through the school-to-prison pipeline. Last year, a report entitled Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Overpoliced, and Underprotected was published as a means of addressing the erasure of Black girls from public dialogue and to call attention to the exclusion of Black girls from national initiatives on race, such as President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative, which was introduced last year, I believe, to address opportunity gaps faced by boys and young men of color. Right now, as the rate of incarceration for Black women is seemingly decreasing, the rate of incarceration for Black girls is actually skyrocketing. As lawyer and legal scholar Priscilla Ochin denotes, the invisibility of Black girls from public discussion and advocacy is not a sign that they're doing okay or are immune to the effects of racism and patriarchy. Black girls, like Black boys, are equally criminalized, adultified, and excluded from the protections of childhood. According to the Black Girls Matter report, the rate of discipline and punishment for Black girls is nearly 10 times higher than it is for white girls. The authors of the report also make other observations in regards to the plight of Black girls and girls of color in America's schools. For example, it was found that Black girls and boys are subjected to larger achievement gaps and harsher forms of discipline than their white counterparts. The authors also determined that increased levels of law enforcement and security personnel within schools sometimes make girls feel less safe and less likely to attend school. Likewise, the application of punitive rather than restorative responses to conflict contributes to the separation of girls from school, leading to their disproportionate involvement in the juvenile injustice system. School-aged Black girls experience higher incidences of interpersonal violence, often in the home, which adversely affects their ability to finish school. The failure of schools to intervene in situations involving the sexual harassment and bullying of girls contributes to their insecurity at school, and the list goes on and on. And while there is some progress on the horizon as it pertains to addressing the very pressing issues Black girls and women face within our prison nation, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. But in order to do the work, we must become tired first. So in closing, I want to draw on part of a quote from Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. There comes a time when people get tired. If you will protest courageously and yet with dignity, when the history books are written in future generations, the historians will have to pause and say, there lived a great people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. Building on King's vision, it is my personal hope that when the history books are written in future generations, that future historians will pause and say, there lived a great people, not just a Black people, but a great people, a human family that was willing to fight together for justice and who won. And that because of their valiant efforts, future generations could have a chance at a brighter future, and hope was restored to those who were never given the opportunity to dream in the first place. So I'll stop there. Thank you.